So speaking of attention, I guess it wasn't last week, the week prior, there was a 60 Minutes piece on military. I guess you would call it price gouging.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, that kind of plays into what you're talking about is it was kind of funny to like see members of the government just sort of like complaining about
Absolutely. I
these
laughed.
companies. And it's like but like you put yourself into this position.
Yes.
And it's like, I don't see how that's anything new.
Yeah, you nailed it. I mean, there's a few things. Like I said, I laughed out loud at that because one, we were just talking about the debt ceiling, and I don't think it's a coincidence that someone basically from the Biden administration leaked this thing about military like price gouging and defense contractors and defense budget right at the time where we're talking about spending cuts. Like, okay, yeah, sure, this is just a coincidence. This is coming up now. But it made me laugh also just because, like, would you say that in your personal life over the past few months or years you went into a store and didn't feel like you were being price gouged? I mean, like, you go out to dinner and you look at the menu prices, or you go to the grocery store, you look at your energy bill. I feel like I'm getting price gouged every day. And for the government, that didn't really seem like a problem for them, because, and this goes back to 2020, and I was furious about this for at least 2 years. That's how long I was on this tangent, because when the pandemic first hit, all the government wanted to talk about was how, like, oh man, prices are so low. We're hitting a period. We're actually worried about deflation, And I was like, are you serious? Because I'd go to the grocery store and my bill was like 2 or 3 times higher than it normally was. I'm like, these prices are going up, not down. And for that whole year, for all of 2020, it was just like, no, inflation is flat at best. It's maybe up 0.1%, like, if anything. And I was like, I'm pretty sure it's higher than that. I wrote whole articles in the Outsider Club about it's actually higher than what the government's reporting. The next year comes around and they're like, oh yeah, prices do seem to be going up, don't they? But don't worry, it's transitory. And then they spent an entire year telling us, oh no, 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 it's just a blip. Like, it's just that prices were so low during the pandemic. They weren't. But they were so low during the pandemic that now the comparables, the year-over-year comparables, look high, but it's really not that bad, and it's going to be gone before you know it. You're all just alarmists.
Well, they were blaming the lack of supply. Oh, it's because
Supply
the lack
chain
of supply.
issues.
Yeah.
We'll get that sorted out now that we're post-pandemic. All of this stuff. And that ended up being bullshit too, right? So the next thing they went to after that, they started blaming us. They go, yeah, okay, inflation's gotten out of control, but the problem is wages are too high. You guys, you're making too much money. That's the issue. The Americans are out here, unemployment's too low. What we're going to have to do is have the Fed raise rates so to not put some of you out on the street and suppress wages, because that's the problem with inflation. And then this happens. We've got a guy in the government come out and go, man, can you believe the price gouging? Can you believe that Raytheon is overcharging us on parts and labor? Like, it happened to us? Like, I can't imagine. I can't imagine why. And what you said about them doing it to themselves is entirely accurate. Because for decades, the government supported efforts in the in the defense, among defense contractors, to consolidate. They pushed industry consolidation. And this has been a challenge for me as a defense stock analyst for a long time. It's taken me a long time to be able to dig in and find companies that supply the bigger companies, because our defense sector is dominated by 5, maybe 6 defense contractors. You're looking at Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. Those are the big 5. And so they get probably 80% of the defense work together. And it's really difficult to dig in and find smaller or even mid-sized companies that get gobbled up. And that's not just a coincidence. That was part of a government effort, because they felt like, oh, if there's industry consolidation, then these suppliers will streamline their businesses. They'll, be more vertically integrated. They will ease kind of the supply chain. Will make things more streamlined.
And hopefully get cheaper prices.
Yes, exactly. And it didn't occur to them that might backfire. That, like, oh, maybe they'll just consolidate and have more leverage. And so now we find ourselves in a situation. And by the way, the entire time that was going on, these industry-friendly policies like I said, they were a product of the lobbying by the defense sector. So members of Congress took the checks from these defense contractors, as they're wont to do. And then they're going to turn around and complain about the leverage that defense contractors have, which they gave them. And another thing that happened, because this came up in the whole 60 Minutes piece about this, it was that the government also laid off thousands of government workers whose job it is to negotiate prices with defense
I was
contractors.
gonna say, isn't there there's not a contract in there? It's just like, hey, we need I mean, one of the things they mentioned was like, oh, we need this part or whatever, and this is the only company that provides it.
Yeah.
Or
So, like, speaking of bureaucracy, yeah, there is an entire, and I know this, I'm really, really familiar with this job because my wife does it. She is a contracting officer for the U.S. Army. She works at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. And so her whole job, and the job of all of her friends and people like her, is they negotiate with defense contractors on these deals. So there are teams of people out there doing this. And that's even how they know that they were being price gouged, is because they investigated it. They're like, well, why are we paying this much for this? And they kind of do this stuff. And, like, that's a thing. And they just laid them all off.
yeah, so how? I mean, if there really is only one supplier, like how can you even negotiate?
Right, and a lot of it's murky. I mean, if they're going to tell you a missile costs this, how are you going to be in position to say, well, no, it doesn't?
Yeah.
You know, it takes a lot, and it becomes, you get into that issue, you would only know if there's a competitor that goes, we could sell you a missile that does the same thing for less. But if there's only, 5 and they're all basically in cahoots with each other and they all hang out and they all go, well, we're charging the government this, they go, great idea. Like, we'll start charging the government that too, and this is why, like, with Raytheon in particular, it's like, yeah, so you're overcharging. Maybe that's why their revenue was up 10% last quarter. Maybe that's why their earnings are up. Maybe that's why they've paid dividends every year going back to 1936. Okay? So the money's there. And, the government they're going to pay it because, again, they're always going to want the latest and greatest stuff. They're always going to want the technology. They're always going to want to look strong. They're always going to want to, like I said, reinforce those job chains that exist. Again, not just in terms of propping up commercial work, putting planes together, putting aircraft carriers together, putting this stuff together, all that manpower, all those jobs, but then the entire government bureaucracy that then goes and orders those things and does the analysis of those things and all these jobs in the Pentagon, these government workers. Because you start cutting the defense budget, well, guess what? You start cutting them too. I mean, the defense budget doesn't all go to missiles. It goes to employees. It goes to people. And they want to protect their constituencies. And so that's what they're going to do ultimately. And that's why all of this stuff about price gouging, it's like, yeah, one, have you been in America recently? And like, what makes you think you're special? And two, you're not going to do anything about it. You're not going to do anything about it. You're going to maybe, at best, instead of raising the defense budget 3% next year, we're going to raise it 1%. So it's still going to increase, but not as much as it would have. And then it's going to go right back up to the $1 trillion I was talking about, probably by the fiscal year 2025.